The term is traditionally associated only with a small part of the field. Mutatis mutandis, my arguments should apply closely to the study of all the arts, less closely but substantially to the history and the social sciences. I will say a little bit about history at one point of my paper. Maybe what I'll say will apply least of all to the truncated discipline that we call philosophy, which I think in a discerning knowledge order would be grouped with the fundamental sciences. Analytic studies in the humanities, especially studies of artistic creations, and the study of anything by definition has to be analytic. But analytic studies of the humanities challenges two shibboleths. One of them holds that the material of the humanities forms a self-contained, self-sufficient order to be justified solely in its unique terms, and that to view it in any broader context does violence to its nature. The other holds that this material is so subtle and so elusively constituted that it can only be assessed in intuitive terms. That is to say, it cannot, strictly speaking, be analyzed at all. In particular, it cannot be quantified. This supposedly traditional attitude towards the humanities is of relatively recent origin. In classical times, whether in India or in the West, scholastic commentary engaged in close and sometimes excessive analysis of the language of a text. In the West, such analysis was an application of the time-honored discipline of rhetoric. The later and more complex field of poetics, I say later because Aristotle did not call his brief tract by that name. That name, that title, Aristotle's Poetics, that evolved virtually through the chance description of titles in later manuscripts. So by and large, poetics, and what we today call poetics, is a more complex field that branched out, compared to rhetoric, into a more diffuse range of structural issues where thematic implications were explored. But this process of thematic inquiry began, for all practical purposes, no earlier than the 18th or even 19th century, depending on which nation and which language we are talking about. I leave it to experts in classical Indian literature to tell us whether the tracing of broad thematic structures in a work, as opposed to the implications of specific phrases, verses, or passages, can be ascribed to Western influence since the 19th century. In any event, this kind of thematic and aesthetic mapping of texts at both overall and local levels dominated the academic interpretation of literature through most of the 20th century. It is the critical practice, broadly unified, though with endless variations, sustaining the rise of English literature faculties in universities across the world through the 20th century. It is the line we inherited from at least our grandparents' day, indeed our great-grandparents' day. In our own generation, some of us in Kolkata had the benefit of intensive training along these lines from a group of outstanding teachers at Presidency College. This critical practice was underpinned. This critical practice was underpinned by a set of formal, or we might loosely say technical concepts relating to genre, structure, tropes, and style. Texts would also be related to their social and historical context of production, often leading to a false etymological notion of context as context, something accompanying a text, which is not, in fact, the root meaning of the word. However, except in declaredly specialist studies, such formal and contextual inquiry was always incidental to the principal business of extracting the intellectual design inherent in the verbal design. Everything else was background. Its relation to the text strictly one way, as a set of common circumstances generating an outstanding work by a chemistry that would not bear close analysis. To anticipate my later argument, this was the position challenged by the late 20th century critical development called New Historicism. The chief purpose of this traditional mode of analysis, and we can fitly call it analysis, often both exacting and complex, its chief purpose was to explore the implications of the text at all levels, starting from the phrase, line, or sentence, and organizing these into a total intellectual structure reflecting the mind and intent of the author. Critics regularly alerted us to the danger of the so-called intentionist fallacy of confining our interpretation to the author's presumed conscious purpose. Nonetheless, this critical methodology focused closely on authorial provenance, or at most on a group of authors or a literary period viewed as a consortium of individuals rather than a social or historical process. An aesthetic assessment of their work or works, favorable in default mode, was an implicit part of the exercise. A very large part of English literary criticism still conforms to this pattern. But about half a century ago, the feeling began to grow that the line had crossed the point of diminishing return and indeed was in danger of implosion. Enterprising scholars were prompted to look outwards at other prospects, unexplored and sometimes forbidding, but promising fresh insights and, for the first time on any scale, applications of textual analysis. The single biggest impetus came from what has, unfortunately but irrevocably, come to be called theory. The theory, as it were, with a capital T, not just theory of this or that, but the collective term for a range of speculative and abstractive inquiry, often related or even incompatible. Certain fields of theory, like the post-structuralism associated with Jacques Derrida, are basically concerned with language and texts. Others, like structuralism, number textual constructs among several major applications that it might relate to good effect. Yet others, like feminism or psychoanalysis, do not primarily relate to texts at all. Some, like post-colonialism and new historicism, generate their own theory around historical and sociological premises. The age of theory has seen more obfuscation and no less cliched and slipshod thinking than most earlier phases of critical history. But it has also been the single greatest force by far in freeing the study of texts from earlier outworn cliches and practices, charging it with new energy and, more crucially, new functions and new ends. It has impressed academia with the perception that texts can be studied for ends that are not solipsist, that are not turned inwards towards the text, but outwards towards other sectors of experience. This is, again, not uniformly true of all bodies of theory, much less so, for instance, of Derridean post-structuralism than of feminism or post-colonialism. But by providing a rationale for the radical reinterpretation of texts, the Derridean notion of deconstruction has defined the methodology of other branches of theoretical inquiry with more practical ends. For good and bad, the study of texts has moved away from the tacit liberal humanism commonly impregnating it in the Anglophone world to other ideological positions. In fact, it has asserted the role of ideological positions in textual analysis in a way that liberal humanism had evaded and implicitly denied. I do not have time to assess the impact of specific fields of theory on the study of texts. I can only note some general consequences. First of all, theoretical factors have made for a radical reordering of the literary canon. It is not only a matter of adding new authors and titles, but of redefining the principles of canon formation. The traditional literary canon, in English as in most other languages and cultures, have been ostensibly aesthetic, whatever forces of cultural politics might have operated in the background. It might have changed over time, sometimes quite markedly, but in response to a revised aesthetics. For the first time, we now see the canon changing to openly accommodate social and historical factors: gender, subalternism, colonialism, other platforms for what we might term positive discrimination in cultural choice. Aesthetic criteria are no longer paramount. Or maybe to put it more correctly, we are witnessing a new aesthetics conditioned by social and political factors. In other words, an aesthetics that is not purely aesthetic. Literary excellence, as conventionally defined, is no longer the sole guiding principle its importance has declined and can, on occasion, be virtually dismissed. Canon formation has become a more inclusive exercise governed by a reevaluation of the social function of literature. Canon formation, of course, is a phenomenon of reception, not of creation. I'm not talking of the socializing of actual works of literature or art, but of their academic analysis. The artist might hold any position, from the markedly aestheticist to the markedly propagandist. The new aesthetics operates across the whole spectrum of artistic commitment. What matters is not the constitution of the original work, but the terms of its analysis by the scholar or interpreter. And what matters to my argument, I mean, of course, I don't mean what matters the wider cultural context. Much more than before, the scholar now orients his analysis externally and contextually to explore its social implications in one direction, and thus necessarily its epistemological implications in another. The work of art is seen as a contingent artifact located in time and space, bound by the specifics of its social context rather than any formal absolutes. It thereby generates a different kind of knowledge, linking the conventional categories of artistic and non-artistic discourse, conventionally literary works and non-literary constructs that articulate the wider discursive genius of the age. This new epistemology of canon-neutral documentation is the precise recourse of new historicism and a crucial resort of feminist and post-colonial interpretation. Here, a play by Shakespeare takes its place within the same discourse as a political dispatch, a letter or diary, and a painting, and perhaps with events and scenes and issues of later periods or even today. This latter category of non-literary or non-artistic witnesses is the central concern of other disciplines like social history, political history, or art history. The association of literary and historical studies is particularly illuminating, as history is the other major discipline that, by however different methods, for whatever different purposes, intensively studies texts and documents. I can at last bring another discipline into my argument when my audience must have dispersed of my ever doing so. I am not